The following podcast series is a production of Building Bridges of Asheville, North Carolina. This series presents in-depth discussions examining systemic racism in the Asheville area and the triumphant stories of Black citizens. On today's episode, our host, Building Bridges co-chair Stephanie Jones-Byrne, is joined by therapist and anti-racism educator Elizabeth McCorvey as they examine systemic racism in healthcare.
Elizabeth McCorvey, thank you so much for being with us this evening, both for our panel on healthcare for the 59th session of Building Bridges and for this additional interview for our new series, our new podcast series. So grateful to you. And I would like to start by asking you to introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your background and about the work you're doing.
Awesome. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Elizabeth. My pronouns are she and her, or she and they. I am a social worker, a licensed clinical social worker, and a mental health therapist I live in Hendersonville, but I work in Asheville. I work with college students at UNCA. I also am contracted with a general practitioner's office. I see a couple clients there. I do a lot of equine assisted psychotherapy. I'm faculty at the Herd Institute, which is an institute in Florida which focuses on teaching therapists how to partner with horses in their clinical work with clients. And I do a lot of anti-racism training and anti-oppressive training specifically for mental health therapists that want to deepen their knowledge of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now I'd like to invite you to just share a bit about how race and racism impact health, both physical and mental, and how it impacts the lived experience of Black and Brown people, BIPOC people.
Yeah. Well, it impacts us in literally every way, from the air we breathe, the water we drink, our access to resources, our access to transportation, our access to mental health care, access to physical health care, our ability to feel safe in our environment, our ability to build community and feel safe with one another, our ability to have our needs met, no matter what those are. And all of that impacts one's mental health. It's really hard to heal from anxiety if you don't know where your next meal is coming from. It's really hard to deal with depression if you have to work 40 hours a week, but the bus is late every single day and it's December and it's snowing and the buses aren't running, but your boss is still expecting you to get to work. So all of these issues are really intrinsically linked, and all of them impact the way that we are able to feel stable and secure and grounded in our sense of our own mental health.
You make a couple of really excellent points about sort of access sometimes to things that folks might take for granted, right? Mm-hmm. That can come out of the systems that we have, where, there's this narrative that comes up where the picture is that there's some sort of deficiency in Black and Brown people, but when right. In fact, it's the deficiency is in the systems that are in place. Mm-hmm. And so we talk a lot in Building Bridges about that difference and about how we're not talking about there being something wrong with Black folks. And it's healthcare is one of those spaces. There are all these spaces, but healthcare is one of those spaces where you do hear narratives about what Black and Brown folks need to do to take better care of ourselves, right? And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about where the gaps are when it comes to what healthcare, which is supposed to help all of us, where that space is deficient for Black and Brown people. And then on the other side, what might be done to improve that situation, to make our systems more equitable so that, our healthcare providers are actually providing quality care to everyone.
Okay, big questions.
It is a big question. And feel free to just focus in on what you see as sort of central, or what is most interesting at the moment. I know we don't have time to. All of these are very big questions, is the thing. So really, part of that is an invitation to just share what you feel most drawn to share at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the major gaps in mental health care, there's so many gaps in the physical health care as well. And I can't speak as much to those from a lived experience perspective in terms of medical stuff not being the work I do. But I know there's a lot of research out there about the gaps in people's ability to access physical health care, and the mortality rates, and being believed about pain, and all of those things. So I encourage people to look more into that if they're drawn to. From a mental health care perspective, when I think about gaps in treatment, I think about how so many of our foundational models that therapists are taught to facilitate with clients. A lot of them were developed in the 60s and way before, and I do not imagine that those were times that were very culturally informed. And so the models that we are using to work with clients today are either, they were tested on folks, on mostly white children, white cishet children, or white cishet adults. Or if they were tested on a more diverse population than that, then they were carried out by clinicians who are not culturally informed. So on either side of the coin, it's not very likely that many of our major tools for working with people were rooted in cultural responsiveness, or they were not rooted in antiracism. There are a lot of other models that are coming to the forefront now that have more of a culturally informed lens. And the fact is, the status of mental health care in this country is that it is primarily carried out by white cishet individuals, white cishet abled neurotypical individuals. And that does not create a fertile ground for supporting people with I hate the word differences, but that are different than the norm, the quote unquote norm. And so anytime I learn a new treatment modality, particularly if it's being taught by a white clinician, then I have to do my own research to figure out how to make it applicable to people of color, to Black people, to people living on stolen land and brown bodies, because it's not one size fits all, but mental health care has been created the foundations of mental health care are in that. And again, there are a lot of ways that folks are trying to deconstruct and decolonize and figure out different ways to make these models more appropriate for a wide variety of people. And I think I looked this up recently. I think it's like 10% of social workers are Black, and like 4% of psychologists are Black. And so we are out there trying our very hardest, but we can't do everything. And we are such a small percentage of the picture. And so there's so many people who are not being served by the healthcare that they're getting, the mental health care that they're getting. And that's the best case scenario, is that they're not being served and that they say, this isn't working for me, and they walk away. The worst case scenario is that they are severely re-traumatized by their experience with a clinician that doesn't understand their experience and isn't doing their own work to unpack the biases that they have. And an even worst case scenario than that is that those stigmas and biases lead to hospitalization or involvement of carceral systems like social services, and police. So we have a lot of power. Therapists have a lot of power, and we have a huge responsibility to meet people's needs in a culturally informed way. And I've been doing anti-racism education for therapists for a little while, and I still, when I when I meet with recent graduates who are about to begin working with clients for the first time, I get the same questions today as I did 4 years ago, as I heard my classmates asking 7 or 8 years ago, that I'm, and I just feel like the way that we're being educated is really deeply flawed.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
That leads into a discussion about how healthcare overlaps with the other topics that we talk about in building bridges. And all of them are huge, and can take a lot more time than we have to take. But we, each week we talk about a different topic. And related to this, we also talk about education and the legal system. And we also talk about housing. And I wonder if you would like to speak a little bit to how healthcare, and in your area of expertise, mental health care, intertwines with, overlaps with all of these other areas when it comes to experiences of Black and brown people, and how racism affects those experiences.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned housing specifically. Are there others?
Yeah. So housing, education, and the legal system, the criminal legal system in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm reading a book. What book was I reading? It talked about, post-traumatic slave syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. She talks about the ways that for children, having parents who were involved in, who were imprisoned, or who are either had a past experience of being in prison or currently in prison, and how that impacts the mental health of the children, and how it impacts their upbringing. And we know that for children, not having a secure attachment to caregivers can be an extremely traumatic experience. And what they are learning or not learning about, and figuring out their sense of self when they have a parent who's incarcerated, especially a parent who's incarcerated wrongfully, or who was targeted unfairly, who isn't receiving a fair trial, which that's the story of so many Black and brown people. All of that impacts the person who's experiencing it, of course, and it impacts the child. And that's a traumatic experience that they take with them growing up, as they figure out how to develop their coping skills, how they figure out how to form secure and safe attachments with other people. And so and then I don't know the statistic, I wish I did, about, but there are some statistics about when a child has a parent who's incarcerated, they are X amount more likely to be incarcerated themselves. And so there's this endless loop, it feels like, that's happening when you talk about the legal system. And that also makes me think of children who have parents who are undocumented, and the challenges that they experience when it comes to trying to live their day-to-day lives in constant hypervigilance about whether they're going to be deported, whether their parents are going to be deported, whether family members, because, Black and brown people are community oriented. So when we talk about family members, we're really talking about like the people that we are deeply connected to sometimes. I don't mean this for all Black and brown people. And so all of the ways that we have to maintain safety in our community and how those get disrupted. So that's what comes to mind when we talk about legally. And the ways that living in that fight or flight mode is not sustainable for a healthy life. Because when you're in fight or flight mode, because you're worried about your next experience of racism, worried about your parents being detained or deported, worrying about what's going to happen at the trial, whether or not the legal system is going to support you in the way that you deserve to be supported, free of bias, being in that constant state of hypervigilance, it impacts your ability to access support. It impacts your ability to think in a way that you feel like is rational for you. It limits your ability to connect with people. It impacts your appetite, your ability to get nutrition. It impacts your ability to be able to create a plan for moving forward, increases your cortisol and your stress hormone. So then you're more easily triggered by events that may not normally trigger you. And so it's not a sustainable way to live your life. And that's the reality for I want to say most Black and brown people living in this country, not knowing when our rights are going to be impacted, or when the next person is going to be killed on national television, or when the next aggressive incident at work is going to happen. And the ways that we have to squelch our own needs in order to be palatable for white culture so that we can break through those glass ceilings, but not fully be ourselves. That's harmful and traumatic. In regard to, I'm thinking about education. I used to do a lot of child and family therapy. And for children who are dealing with challenges at home, especially Black and brown children who are dealing with challenges related to parent not being able to meet their needs, that impacts attachment. And the way that we become attached to our caregivers and the ease with which we're able to do that impacts the way that we have relationships. We're able to experience relationships as adults. And if you've got teachers that have unexamined biases that they have not examined, that they haven't figured out how to uncover, then that can impact a child's ability to thrive in the classroom. If they have, frankly, children should not have to sit for 8 hours in a classroom, and that cannot possibly be the most effective way for them to learn. But kids who come from cultures where families are big and boisterous and loud, and for them to be expected to sit for that extended period of time and focus and pay attention. And that doesn't even take into account children who are neurodivergent. I talked a little bit during the panel about how for young Black boys in particular, they are misdiagnosed often with ADHD when in fact it's symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, because they look the same, but they cannot be treated the same. If you treat ADHD as if if you treat post-traumatic stress as if it's ADHD, you're essentially putting a really bad Band-Aid on symptoms that cannot be resolved with behavioral treatment, with only a behavioral plan. And then you're setting that child up for failure. And so having teachers that are not versed in cultural competence or coming from a culturally informed lens can really impact a child's ability to thrive in the educational setting. And then that impacts Black and brown folks in no matter what level of education they're seeking. Not having teachers that are culturally aware or are teaching outdated material or only teaching material from one perspective. And I really find in the educational system, Black and brown folks we're taught to gaslight ourselves into thinking that our experience isn't valid. And again, that of course impacts stress hormones, that impacts depression and anxiety, where we end up being in a really abusive relationship with white culture, which has unrealistic, unfair, and biased expectations for what it means to be safe in community. I think yes, there were a couple other areas.
The last one is housing, and you have talked a lot about community, and when we're talking in our groups about housing, we're looking at, again, inequity to a large degree, right? And some sort of on paper things like redlining, for instance,
oh my gosh,
and segregation and
gentrification.
Exactly. Yes. Gentrification. We talk a lot here in Asheville about the effect of urban renewal, for instance, in Asheville on Black folks in particular. And so, yes, if you'd like to speak to, some of those connections with housing and how access to it, how it might look, has traditionally and continues to look different quite often for Black and brown folks, and how that relates to mental health.
Yeah. Well, and that for me, there's a link there to policing, of course, and how communities communities that are Black and brown are disproportionately policed, and how the people's reactions to a white man on the side of the road are very different than their reactions to a Black man on the side of the road. And they're more likely to call the police to have them intervene in that situation. So that was the first example that came to mind. Related to the gentrification and the erasure of communities and history, that's traumatic. And the ways that I think that I learned this at the REI training about how you can find the Black and brown districts on a map in the exact same ways today as you could back during Jim Crow era because of redlining. And so those lines are still there. They just aren't quote unquote legal anymore. But the ways that white communities are shrinking and shrinking Black and brown communities, that's still happening, and it's still prevalent in the exact same ways as it was back in the day. And so it makes me think of, certainly in Asheville, how folks have been priced out of living in Asheville. So even though you might have a server who is Black or brown, the likelihood that they are able to comfortably afford the cost of living to be here, it's extremely unlikely. And that because of the way economics and capitalism has occurred in this country, that the wealth disparity disproportionately impacts Black and brown people. I'm also thinking about the intersections of like homeless shelters, for example, and how if you are Black and brown and you're also trans, then the likelihood that you're able to find a shelter that accepts you is extremely tiny. And even if it exists, like, you have to figure out a way to get there. So maybe there is one, but it's 10 miles from you. How are you going to get there? It is not safe to hitchhike as a trans person. It's not safe to travel. It's barely safe to travel by foot, especially if, during certain hours of the night. And so I just think about, when I think about housing, I think about safety, and lack of safety for Black and brown people.
Thank you. Yes, you made so many connections there. I really appreciate that. Some things that I hadn't thought of before, even while thinking of this many times during building bridges. And so that's why it's so great to have these conversations. It's always finding new perspectives and new thoughts. Thank you so much for that. I wonder if you can talk a little bit and this came up in the panel discussion as well, but if you wouldn't mind revisiting the idea of what folks can do potentially on a personal level, or in the ways that they interact with systems to try and improve these inequities.
My answer is different for white folks and for Black and brown people. For white folks, my charge is always to start a conversation, start getting comfortable being uncomfortable, because silence is literally killing Black and brown people. White folks is your disinterest in feeling uncomfortable is lethal to us. And for Black and brown people, my invitation is to rest, recover, and take care of yourself, because the system is not fair, and it was not designed for you. It was not designed for me. And as a therapist, that's one of the hardest things I feel like that I run up on, is that I don't have any suggestions. I don't have any advice for Black and brown people. Because it's a system of oppression. And if I had the answer, if I could bottle that up and give that to Black and brown folks, I absolutely would. But eventually I feel like I get to a point, because systems of oppression impact everything, every single thing. White supremacy is in everything. There is not a conversation I have that cannot lead in some way back to white supremacy. And eventually what we get down to is like, yeah, that system is killing you, and that system is impacting you. And I hear you. I don't know what to tell you. And so rest, find community, find allies white allies that you can send in when you need to take a break, and keep caring for each other.
Well, and thank you for that. And I think something you mentioned in the panel and may have mentioned again here, but I just want to highlight is that one of the things that happens that negatively impacts the health of Black and Brown people is not being heard by people who are supposed to be caring for them, not being listened to. And that seems like such a small thing, but it is such a huge thing. And so I feel like that's one of the places where, even while we're in this inequitable system that needs to be changed so drastically, even something like that, where people understand that part of it is just listening to folks and believing them, is so huge. And that when we feel heard and believed, that in itself, at least in some small way, can make us feel better. And
it can be
take care of ourselves.
It can be very healing to not just feel heard, but also be seen, that that I'm not the only person who sees this inequality, that there's somebody else there who is seeing it and acknowledging it and taking a little bit of the burden off of my shoulders to always be the one to name things.
Yeah. Thank you again so much, Elizabeth. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So grateful. And I hope you are taking good care of yourself. I would invite everyone who's listening to do the same, and to do whatever they can in their little corner. And thank you again so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
This has been a production of Building Bridges of Asheville. For more information, please visit our website at bbavl.org.